In the ancient symbolic traditions attributed to Thoth, seeing was never about the physical eyes alone. It was a disciplined state of awareness. To see, in this framework, meant to recognize patterns beneath appearances, power structures, cognitive traps, and emotional manipulations that govern human behavior. Thoth's teaching did not grant followers the ability to perceive invisible entities, but rather the capacity to detect influence, where influence hides best, inside habits of thought. The so-called chosen ones were not selected by destiny or bloodline. They were individuals willing to undergo intellectual discomfort. Thoth's tradition demanded skepticism toward authority, language, and even one's own assumptions. This is why the metaphor of physical eyes appears so often in later interpretations. It suggests that once awareness is trained deeply enough, deception becomes as obvious as a visible object in the room. In this symbolic system, Archons represent systems of control, fear-based narratives, inherited dogmas, economic pressures, and psychological conditioning. They are not creatures but mechanisms. They persist only as long as they remain unseen. When Thoth students learned to see, what they actually learned was to recognize when their reactions were being guided rather than chosen. This is why knowledge is framed as threatening. A system that relies on compliance cannot tolerate widespread awareness. Thoth's lessons emphasized literacy, logic, emotional regulation, and pattern recognition skills that dissolve blind obedience. To see an Archon, then, is simply to notice when a belief benefits power rather than truth. Thus, the fear attributed to Archons is metaphorical. What they fear is exposure. When people understand how narratives are constructed, how fear is amplified, and how identity is manipulated, the system loses its invisibility, and invisibility is its greatest strength. Thoth's teachings emphasized discipline over revelation. There was no sudden awakening, no mystical flash. Perception was trained slowly through repetition, questioning language, tracing incentives, and observing emotional triggers. The student was taught to ask not "is this true?" but "who benefits if I believe this?" This approach reframes vision as a cognitive skill. Just as physical eyesight can be sharpened or dulled, perception can be refined or degraded. Constant distraction, emotional overload, and simplified narratives weaken perception. Silence, reflection, and structured inquiry strengthen it. The Archon metaphor becomes clearer here. An Archon is any force that thrives on unexamined reactions. Fear-based news cycles, rigid ideological identities, and moral panics function as archonic systems. They do not require belief in monsters, only uncritical participation. To see with physical eyes is symbolic language describing how abstract manipulation becomes concretely recognizable. Once trained, a person can spot the same patterns everywhere: crisis framing, false dilemmas, manufactured enemies, and appeals to authority disguised as concern. Thoth's discipline required responsibility. Seeing manipulation does not make one superior. It makes one accountable. Once you recognize a false narrative, you must decide whether to repeat it. Ignorance can excuse participation. Awareness cannot. This is why the path was reserved for a few, not because it was hidden, but because it was demanding. Most people prefer certainty to inquiry. The Archons, as metaphors, rely on this preference. They are strongest where questioning feels exhausting. Thus, the discipline of perception is not mystical, it is ethical. It asks whether one will trade comfort for clarity, belonging for truth, or certainty for understanding. That choice, not secret knowledge, defines the chosen. One of the central insights attributed to Thoth is the power of language to shape perception. Words do not merely describe reality, they filter it. Categories, labels, and slogans compress complexity into manageable forms, often at the cost of truth. In this sense, Archons operate primarily through language. When language becomes rigid, thought follows. When certain questions become taboo, inquiry collapses. Thoth students were trained to dissect phrasing, to notice emotional loading, and to recognize when language substitutes reaction for reasoning. To see an Archon is often to hear it first. Repeated phrases that shut down debate, moral absolutes that erase nuance, binary choices that exclude alternatives. These are not accidents. They are linguistic tools of control. Physical eyes enter the metaphor when language becomes so transparent that its manipulative structure is visible. The student no longer hears a message as content alone, but perceives its architecture, what is emphasized, what is omitted, and what emotional response is being engineered. This is deeply unsettling to systems of power. A population that understands rhetorical framing is difficult to mobilize through fear or outrage. When people recognize how words are used to divide, provoke, or pacify, the spell weakens. Thoth's lesson here is not silence but precision. Speak carefully. Listen analytically. Treat language as a technology, not a neutral medium. Those who master this skill begin to see control mechanisms embedded in everyday communication. The Archons fear this not because language awareness destroys them instantly, but because it spreads. Once one person points out the structure, others begin to notice it too. Language loses its invisibility, and with it, much of its power. In the symbolic cosmology, fear is the energy source of Archons. Fear narrows attention, accelerates judgment, and suppresses curiosity. It makes complex realities feel intolerable, demanding simple answers and strong authorities. Thoth's teachings approached fear not as an enemy to be eliminated, but as a signal to be examined. What exactly is being threatened? Identity, status, safety, belonging. Each fear reveals the leverage point being exploited. To see fear clearly is to weaken its grip. When fear is unnamed, it dominates behavior. When it is identified, it becomes manageable. This is why systems of control discourage introspection and promote constant urgency. The metaphor of physical sight emphasizes immediacy. A trained individual recognizes fear narratives instantly, the way one recognizes smoke as a sign of fire. The body reacts, but the mind remains engaged. This capacity is destabilizing to manipulative systems. Fear works best when it feels natural and justified. When people pause to analyze it, the emotional cascade slows. Decisions become deliberate rather than reactive. Thoth's students practiced emotional literacy alongside logic. They learned to separate sensation from interpretation. Anxiety might be real, but its cause may be misrepresented. Anger may be justified, but its target may be misdirected. Archons, as metaphors, cannot survive sustained emotional clarity. They depend on confusion between feeling and fact. When individuals reclaim that distinction, control becomes expensive and unreliable. Thus, the fear attributed to Archons is again symbolic. Awareness raises the cost of manipulation. It does not end power, but it forces power to justify itself. A critical aspect often omitted in sensational retellings is responsibility. Thoth's tradition did not promise liberation without burden. To see clearly is to lose the comfort of illusion. It means recognizing one's own participation in harmful systems. The chosen ones were not heroes, but witnesses. They understood that seeing manipulation does not grant immunity from it. Awareness requires continuous effort. Fatigue, social pressure, and self-interest can still erode clarity. This is why secrecy was not the point. The teachings were demanding, not hidden. Most people encountered the ideas and walked away not because they were forbidden, but because they were inconvenient. To see Archons is to see oneself reflected in them. Habits of avoidance, desire for certainty, preference for comfort. Thoth's lesson was inward as much as outward. Control persists not only because it is imposed, but because it is often welcomed. The seer's responsibility is restraint. Not every illusion needs confrontation. Not every system can be dismantled immediately. Wisdom lies in choosing where clarity can reduce harm rather than inflame conflict. This ethical dimension is what separates perception from paranoia. Seeing patterns does not mean assuming intentional evil everywhere. It means evaluating evidence, incentives, and outcomes with discipline. The Archons fear reckless revelation, then they fear patient, ethical clarity. Panic sustains them, calm undermines them. In the final analysis, Thoth's teaching is not about triumph over hidden enemies, but about sustained human maturity. Seeing is not a destination, it is a practice. Each generation must relearn it under new conditions. Modern Archons do not look ancient. They appear as algorithms, incentives, institutions, and narratives. They are complex, often unintentional, and sometimes useful. The goal is not destruction, but discernment. To see with physical eyes today is to notice when technology shapes attention, when metrics replace meaning, and when speed overrides understanding. These are not conspiracies, they are structural tendencies. Thoth's enduring lesson is humility. Clarity today does not guarantee clarity tomorrow. The mind must be trained continuously, or perception dulls. The Archons return not because they are powerful, but because vigilance fades. Thus, the true fear is not that Archons dread being seen, but that people will stop looking. Awareness is fragile. It requires effort, courage, and patience. In this symbolic reading, Thoth offers no prophecy, only a method. Learn to observe, learn to question, learn to recognize when fear, language, and habit converge to limit thought. That is what it means to see.